Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers Need Help. We are excited to be back, and we're talking all about plotting and craft today. But first of all, let's catch up. We haven't seen Alicia in a while. So do you have any news or anything to share?
No news. Still working on the adult fantasy. It's going really well. I'm loving it, and like to the point where I don't even want to like stop to eat or sleep or do anything. But so that's nice. That's a nice change.
Wow, yeah, that's exciting. And you have it all plotted out as we've heard. So yeah. So that's exciting. Very cool. Scarlett, what about you?
I'm working on King of Battle and Blood, and it is a real challenge. And yeah, I sold the rights to literally all my books to Brazil too. That's my most recent foreign sell. So cool things.
Yeah, that's exciting. Awesome. Well, for me, not too much. I'm working on an adult project right now, and I should finish the first draft on Friday, so that will be exciting. So yeah, just having fun on that, working in a different genre, and I'm going to try to get, I'm on a good pace this year, so that's great. I felt like last year I was accomplishing a lot, but then I was working on this really complicated novel that I wrote like 4 times. So it's like I wrote a lot of things, but it was kind of writing the same thing over and over again. And the same with this other project that's not going to go anywhere. So I'm hoping this year I will work on more projects that actually go somewhere. That is my goal. And we see puppies. Yes, we need the puppy action for sure. But yeah, so tonight we are talking about plotting and craft, and essentially, well, more than plotting, kind of how to wrap all the elements together to create a compelling story, including action and fully developed characters and all of the other elements that you might want to wrap in. So we're going to start kind of broad, and we're also taking your questions. So if anybody has questions they want to get in about crafting compelling stories, get those in the comments, and we will tackle those as well. But there's so much that goes into crafting a compelling story, trying to hold all of these elements in your head at once and do them all well, not just the plotting. So where do you start with such an overwhelming task? And so Alicia, I know since you just kind of plotted after having written a quick draft of this book, right? What would you say, like, where do you usually start in putting together a huge project like this?
So like putting it together after having the first draft, or
no, just like from the beginning. Because it is so huge, and so I think you're in that process right now, right? Of adding in layers, I guess, and things like that as you go.
Yeah. So for me, the premise usually comes first, or I guess the character does. For my historical fantasy, it's I find a compelling character with an interesting line of their history in the history of time, and then I come up with a premise, and I try to think of premises that are exciting, at least for me. Like there's got to be a touch of magic or something, and then from there I like also dive into research of, well, how much historical stuff can I get in here with also like spinning whatever magic thing that I'm adding to it. And from at that point, once I have like that kind of narrowed down, is when I take out my favorite craft books and they just help. They help me ask the right questions about plot and about theme and about character arc in particular, because the way I write is very character driven, and I want the premise can happen to the character, but I want every plot point really to be something that the character has done, and like forced that to happen instead of the story forcing things upon the character. And then from there, layering. Oh, yes. Draft 1 is usually me just trying to get the story right, get the plot and the characters right, motivations, character arc, all of that. And now in draft 2, I have to refine the plot and refine the character arcs and the voice. The voice is a big thing. And then usually after that is when I refine the descriptions, make sure the world building is pretty and exciting and unique. And then after that, it's making the prose really pretty. I try to do that in the beginning drafts because it's really hard for me to like any of my writing if it's just bare bones. But yeah, so it's a little bit cleaner, I think, of a first or second draft than some people write.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, everybody starts in a different place, I think, because it is so much. It's so much to keep together in your head to try to get all of those elements to work in harmony together. But yeah, for me, sometimes I will start with a question. If there's something that I don't understand about the world, so maybe it's death, and that's why 3 of my middle grade novels are all about death and grief and tackling it from different perspectives. And then so I'll kind of know that I'm trying to answer a big question. And then the next place I'll go is the character. And I always ask myself the 2 big questions: what does the character want and what does the character need? I'm sure I've talked about it before, but so whatever the character wants, some kind of goal thing they're hoping to achieve, is what's going to drive the action story. And so as I'm starting, I don't do a lot of outlining or plotting, but I'll get the big beats like in a 7-point plot scheme or something like that for the action story. And then I actually do a separate one for the emotional story. And I'm always stronger on the emotional story than the action story in the beginning. Like even with some of my novels, particularly like this one, when I sold it, it almost doubled from the time when I sold it to the time when it was released, because initially it was really the emotional storyline, and there was the whole magic of the skeleton that grows up in a boy's backyard and only children can see it, and obviously it's symbolic of death, and so his changing relationship is like his internal relationship with death changes as his external relationship with the skeleton changes. All of that was there, but like there was no additional action story, which was layered in later, which so if you read it today, there's this additional action story that's very middle grade friendly about there's this archaeology photo contest, and he's trying to like gather physical evidence of the skeleton that's growing in his backyard, and it has to do with him trying to essentially win his dad back, who has left the family, like get his attention again. And so like that whole thing, it's also tied into a second like emotional plot, but it wasn't even in like any of the early drafts. So I'll tend to start with the emotional draft, and I'm trying to get better about having the emotional story and the action plot be very tied together, and having them both kind of the vague idea, at least, of them from the beginning. And that's usually where I start: what the character wants, what they need. What they need is their usually some kind of emotional lack, or just an emotional thing they need to address throughout their journey that they are not aware of in the beginning, but by the end of this journey that they've gone on, they have changed their view of themselves or the world to such an extent that now they have addressed this need without like even realizing it generally. So that's where I start, but all of the kind of layers and depth and things like that will generally come in future drafts. And I don't use craft books, I will say. Like when I was first starting out, I kind of absorbed them. And now if I do use things like that, I'll use it in the revision phase. But like just the way my brain works, I can't use it in the beginning phase. And that's the same way I don't outline in the beginning phase, because that's the analytical part of the brain for me. And that's separate than like the creative part of the brain, which is what I use to like actually put words on paper. So the analytical part, like, is something I would probably come back in the revision phase, and I'll redo the 7-point plot structure and be like, did I actually do what I set out to do, and like how can I fix it now that I didn't. So that's generally how I approach it. But Scarlett, what would you say is your approach to writing a compelling story, whatever that means? That's a big word, right?
Yeah, compelling is subjective, like all of writing. I I don't know. I think I just start with I hear characters' voice really loud, and they start usually arguing about something or they hate something, and then I just keep asking, why are you arguing? Why do you hate each other? Why do you hate the situation? And so I just spend a long time kind of daydreaming about and hearing those scenes and writing them down, and then I get to a point where I feel like I can put it in chronological order, and then I start writing for like free writing for about 40,000 words, and then I decide I can't go any farther that way and make a outline and start writing all over from the very beginning. And that's what it is, but mostly it's characters who talk first, and they kind of tell me the story, and then I go from there.
Yeah, it's so interesting how different everyone's process is, but I think that's what you learn when you start to do lots of panels and things like this, is that everyone has a very different way of approaching it, but also there's a lot of crossover and a lot of similarities. So Alicia, we know you are like the super plotter, right? So, and you have your I know you use like a certain method for this last one. So do you want to talk about that? And is this your favorite method that you've used for your book so far?
Oh, that's a good question. So I have like three favorites. But the one that I keep going back to that has never failed me is the Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. I actually used Anatomy of a Story for the first draft, and that took me from just having the historical character in mind and knowing where I wanted her to end up, like the basic premise of her story. And Anatomy of a Story like exploded everything, gave me all these characters and even like the magic I wanted, but it went too big and I went so complicated that I actually lost the premise. When I went back to read it, I realized like she's not even doing the thing that I wanted her to do in the first place. So I scrapped all that and went back to Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which walks you through the 15 beats of a story. And these 15 beats, basically Save the Cat is a screenwriting tool that every like screenplay, every movie has, but every book has them too. Even like picture books, it's just beats of a story. But the way that it's like laid out, she describes what each beat does and why it's needed and how it moves your character arc. So that's why I really love using that one, because it helps me plot with character arc in the forefront. And I have a very analytical brain, so my creativity is tied in that. So like I get so excited. Like if I could just get paid to write beat sheets for every idea I have, I would do that, because that gets me so excited. My creative juices are flowing. And it usually takes me about like 2 weeks to go through that book. And then I have all 15 beats plotted out. And I usually from there as well also have the transition scenes to get me from beat 1 to beat 2 or beat 3 to 5 or like that kind of stuff. And this last time it took me about 3 weeks. I did the beat sheet and I figured out, I knew every single chapter. And now I'm just like pushing through. Not even a slog. It like really reignited my love for the story, because I was like, no, I wanted her to do this one thing. And like, I built the entire story around that finally, which is what I should have done from the beginning.
Yeah, that's really awesome. It's very cool that you found one that's really working well for you, or several.
Yeah,
that
that one has actually helped me write at least one other book. I think two other books. And one of them I think is like the best book I've written so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, I've been thinking about it lately because right now I'm working on something that's very different from my other books. Like my middle grade books are kind of this interesting blend of something that's more like literary realistic fiction, but with fantasy and like speculative elements layered into that. And I'm working on something now that's like straight up genre cozy mystery, which is very it's meant to have a certain formula, and like there are certain tropes that you're expected to include. And I thought that would be a tough transition for me because of the way that I write my middle grade. It is so intuitive in a way, and I feel like I can't use the analytical side of my brain because when you're telling a character story like that, and like the main focus of the story is like they're coming from this one emotional state to this other state, there are a million ways that they could affect that change. It's all about what is the most impactful way to get there, right?
Mhm.
But there are a million different choices. And for me, when it's mainly this emotional change, I can't put that in an outline and have it be effective because I have to feel it as I write the character to know if it's authentic for who they are. And so for that type of story, it doesn't work for me to outline to that level of detail. So I use the 7-point plot structure, which is also from screenplays, but it only has 7 beats, and so it's much more the broad strokes of the story. So I can kind of do that, but it's really all about putting it down on paper for the more literary stories, I guess. But like, for the cozy mystery, I found that I was able to plot the whole thing out and plot out like every chapter, and I'm writing them, and I feel good about it because it's just a different type of story. Like I feel like it was a puzzle, and so I worked out the best way that I wanted the puzzle to happen. And now I'm just writing it, and that's so much more straightforward. Whereas like before, it's like I can write like a character story like 50 different ways, and only one of those ways is going to feel right to me, and there's no like particular reason I can pinpoint for that, but it just feels like the most impactful. So it's much more nebulous, that process. So for me, it really depends. Like how I plot it out is really going to depend on the type of story that I'm writing, is what I found. But Scarlett, you kind of described your process, but is there any like plotting method that you've used that you found helpful?
I do this thing in this worksheet that's in The Magic Words by Cheryl Klein, which is the book you introduced me to. And I like it because it has you can find it on her website, but it has a space for like their emotional stakes and the external stakes. And you choose if you have a conflict plot or an action plot or a mystery plot. And I just found like the way she lays out basically the structure of a story helps my brain more, because I often the way I structure a book is more so like, this is an action and this is the consequence of that action, and this is the action that stems off of that, and this is the consequence. And so so that really helps my brain organize that information, and I can ensure that I hit all of those emotional arcs. It's always a good reminder for me. So I do that, and then I do this other thing that I don't know where I read this at, but you write like 20 things down that you want to happen in your book, and usually all 20 things end up in my books. So yeah, it's more like free writing again, but there's a little bit of structure to it, so that helps me.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So I think no matter what kind of book you're writing, there are going to be some scenes that are more difficult to write or to plot, or you can plot them out and they feel like this huge climactic thing, but then when you start to write them, maybe you're not feeling it, or maybe they're hard to write because they are so like huge, and it's just kind of difficult to get through them. Have you had those scenes that for whatever reason were a lot more difficult to write than the rest of the story? And what did you find a method that got you through that? I'll send it to Alicia. It's a tough question, but
this is actually perfect timing because I just had this happen. So Friday I was writing a scene that was backstory. It was showing, I wanted to show where this spark for the main character's desire came from. Like, why does she want this thing? And so I really wanted it to be like visceral and like not just a little paragraph of her like saying it to someone or thinking it in like so many words. I wanted to show a whole scene. And I wrote on Friday. And the whole time I was writing on Friday, I was like, this is wrong. Like, this is like, I'm having fun in this scene, but it's wrong. And it's taking way too long. It was getting up to like 2,000 words. And I was like, no, this is not, if it's a flashback, it shouldn't be this long. So then I tried rewriting that on Saturday. And what I did was I still had the main concept of showing where her desire came from. And that included this one other character, but the setting changed. I changed the setting. I changed like their interaction to build up to the moment of it, the desire like clicking in the main character's head. And at the time on Saturday, I was like, yeah, this is right. And then I didn't have a chance to finish it until this morning. And I like reread through it and I was like, no, this is wrong too. So I scrapped 3,000 words and started over, and it finally clicked. Hopefully when I reread it tomorrow morning, it's still good. It's the right length. So I hope it's fine.
That's interesting. So I guess, are you the type of person that rereads the previous day's words before you do the next day? Not usually? Okay.
No, not usually, but this scene in particular, I was having such a hard time finding my way into and finding the right way to do it that I was like, I couldn't move on until I had like figured it out. So, yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I do that a lot. Like I don't know, like I'll have some strange idea maybe, and I'll start moving away from my initial intention. And I'll be like, I have that same thing. Like, you can tell that it kind of feels wrong, but you just want to keep going with it for a certain amount of time because you're like, but I already started this. Let me just go with it. And then you get to that point, you're like, okay, I'm going to have to go back and just change.
But I think when that happens, like how you were saying earlier, there are so many ways to get the character from one emotion to the other. And I think you need to listen to your gut when you're writing the scene and your gut tells you you're doing it wrong. Then be okay with changing it up. Change the setting, change the dialogue if certain characters have to be there, or the setting has to be a certain thing. Like keep the thing that has to stay the same, and then just like try everything until your gut is like, there you go. Now it's good.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And, for me, like right now, when I'm working on the mystery, what I find myself doing more is veering from the outline that I have, since it's not a huge outline, but I just have a like big paragraph that's like, here's what happens in every chapter or something. And now whenever I start to veer from them, I'm like, actually, that's going to end up changing a bunch of things. Just go back to what you originally, usually in a lot of my other books, it will kind of be it'll be more the character or like the emotional stuff, and I'll kind of allow myself to explore it more because maybe it is better. And that's how I end up rewriting things like over and over again, is that when I'm exploring those emotions, I feel like I don't I'm not able to find the best way to tell the story until maybe I've done it once or twice. And that's why I end up doing it multiple times. But now they're doing something that really, it doesn't have like this huge like character change or whatever. Because usually in a cozy mystery, like the main characters are kind of affecting the world around them, but they're not necessarily having a huge like internal change or whatever throughout the story. So it's actually been interesting, very different and like interesting story. And I find myself more concerned about sticking to the plot than worrying about like the big character elements and stuff, which is kind of nice. It's kind of a nice change. But Scarlett, have you had certain scenes that gave you more difficulty than others, and how did you navigate those?
I think when I was writing Malice, the fight scenes were the hardest, and I just skipped them. And then when I went back to read from the beginning and go through my first edit, that's when I wrote them, because sometimes I think you just get so, I don't know, bogged down in words that it makes writing something like that really difficult. There were also a lot of elements to those, like you have to think through what kind of powers do these people have and how do gods fight and things like that I didn't really want to think through at the time. But right now I'm writing King of Battle and Blood, and they're traveling and I'm bored. So I'm just like slogging through. So I just tell myself to keep going. I'm just like, keep going until you hit 40,000 words, and then you can rewrite. Alicia, were you going to say something?
So I noticed with Sarah J. Maas that at least in the Throne of Glass series, when she had, there was like a whole book of all these characters traveling. And I noticed that, like, to make it interesting, she had not the two main characters, like not the core group, but like the side characters all hooking up. So there was like exciting sexual tension everywhere, but it was basically just like 400 pages of travel.
Yeah, well, the two main characters are the ones that are hooking up, but it's also like, I just am like, God, we've got to put another tent up. And I just want to be to this destination.
But aren't you like a huge fan of epic fantasy, like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit?
Yeah, I am.
They do a lot.
But I will say, like, I totally preferred, not keeping up with Sam and Frodo, like in the books. But I also think that's just because I am figuring things out as I go, and I haven't written quite this kind of epic fantasy in a while. Like New Greece was sort of handed to me from myth, and only part of this is myth, like the vampiric myths. So so I just honestly just keep rewriting until it gets there. I force it.
Yeah, that's so funny. Because that's the same for me in that it's not the big, like, the death scenes or like the really emotional scenes. Those are the easiest scenes for me to write, because once you get to there, like, you're so in the flow. And that's the whole point of the novel, is getting to those scenes that are the most like impactful, that you're like, oh yeah, like those are great. But it's the middle scenes or the transition scenes or the ones where, like, you have to get them somewhere, but like in that particular scene, maybe you've lost the character's like motivation, or like you're just, those are the scenes that are hard for me. So I usually find myself like slowing down at the keyboard, and like the words are just harder to pull out in scenes like that. So I have to refocus and be like, okay, but what is, can I give the character something more, like a more important reason to be doing this? Can I add some kind of other element of interest to make this more fun? Like, what can I do? So I have more difficulty with those scenes than the really like emotional ones. And And yeah, I'm doing in my current story, I'm having a lot of fun banter. Like witty dialogue is kind of the fun thing that's getting me through in this in the mystery, because the main characters are these two sisters that are kind of total opposites, and they have been sort of estranged for like a number of years, and now they're thrown back together. So there's lots of fun banter going on between them that kind of helps things move forward. But yes, so we've talked about kind of the overall, the big plotting, the scenes. What about getting those other elements in? So no matter what type of story you're writing, you're usually going to insert some kind of like lighter elements and humor to break up the tension or whatever it is. So how do you kind of strike that balance of having various moods and like tones, and you're sort of like going from something that's really heavy and then kind of breaking it up with humor or something like that? Is that something that you think about when you're plotting, or does it just kind of come about naturally? I'll send it to Alicia.
It definitely comes about naturally. I never really think about my humor, but I tend to write sarcastic and or jokey characters. So it's really their voice that's coming through, and like, yeah, I like the characters that'll crack a joke in the middle of a bloodbath.
I mean, yes, you have to have the quipping, right? Like people have to be quipping back and forth when they're slaying people or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I do that especially. I do think about it more consciously, like in the middle grade, especially because I write about a lot of heavy topics. So when you're writing for kids and you're writing stories about death and grief, like you have to really make sure that you have throughout. I mean, you end on a hopeful moment always, and then anytime there's something really heavy that happens, you want to follow it by something that's lighter and more whimsical and insert that humor. But I also think like inserting humor actually can heighten the impact of the sad thing that just happened too, because somehow having that contrast, like juxtaposing the two, makes them both, I think, seem a little bit stronger. So yeah, I do think about it a lot, like ways to keep it light. And just as a person, I tend to want to go very heavy. And so trying to lighten it up is always in the forefront of my mind, I would say.
I heard Lori Haltz Anderson talk about going through, when she's reading through her draft, she will make a plus or minus at the end of each chapter to see, it will denote like where the character's emotional arc is. Was it a heavy emotional scene? It gets like a negative. If it was a positive, the emotions are happy and high, it gets the positive sign. And then she'll look through it and make sure that there's a variance, that it's not just like high, 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 low, 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 low. And I've done that a few times, and it really opened my eyes to how, like, yeah, if you have like a lot of chapters back to back that are really heavy, it's kind of hard to get through. You want to follow up the heavy with a little bit of a light or a happy. And I think that goes for any genre. Like,
yeah. I mean, there are some books that are purposefully like, yes, we'll never relent, you know, but that's what it is. But yeah, definitely. And it doesn't necessarily have to be humor. Like in my books, like I know in Skeleton Tree, for example, which is, you know, it's all about death and loss, but they're constantly, I don't know how many cookies, like how much hot chocolate they eat in this book. It's like every scene they're getting cookies and hot chocolate and just like comforting foods brought to them and stuff. And so just kind of bringing it down to a situation that's more familiar too, and like just any sort of thing that's like comforting can bring you back to that space where you feel like a sense of safety again, and it's not like, oh, this scary thing is happening. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be humorous. But Scarlett, what would you say? You have a lot of like intense things happening, so how do you like vary that tension and things throughout?
I think that I know I think about it, but it's not like it's not planned. I know that I remember in Malice having to being like, okay, I haven't mentioned Apollo in a while. I have to figure out how this scene threads into this. Or Hermes is definitely my comic relief character. And then there's just a lot of witty banter between all the characters. I like to tell people it's because I'm hilarious. So but I realize like in the book that I'm writing now in KBB, there's just mostly like sarcastic banter, and there's no one who's just like super funny like Hermes. So I think that's kind of one area that I have to like work on because but yeah, I think creating that character like someone like Hermes who is like very funny and like always upbeat, but there's like this other element to him too, where he's like a warrior, and he like he grieves as well. And so I think like providing that depth to even those characters is really important. So yeah, I don't know. I just do it kind of, I wish I could do the plus and negative thing. Like I'm sitting here being like, man, you need to be more organized. Like you sound so chaotic. But I'm not, and I never will be. So I just kind of do it based on my gut, what I feel needs to happen. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, I don't do the plus minus thing either, although that's a really good idea. But I do just do it with my gut, and everyone's going to be different. I mean, my stories are probably always going to be a little on the heavy side, but that's just what I like to write. So, but yeah, I like what we were talking. You mentioned on the secondary cast, and because we've mostly been focusing on the POV characters when we're talking about the character arcs. So let's talk about that a little bit, like trying to make the secondary cast have some depth as well, and maybe their own little mini arcs and whatnot, depending on the story. So Alicia, for your story that you're plotting right now or you're drafting now, is this like a multi-POV or a single POV?
This is a dual POV, so 2 points of view. Yes.
Interesting.
I changed it from the first draft.
Okay, so like in that case, because I think for me, I would end up doing a 7-point plot structure for each character like separately. Did you do it for them separately, or did you do it all together?
Nope, I did 2 beat sheets for both of them. Yeah. I did them in tandem, so when I was working on the first beat, I wrote both of theirs. That way,
gotcha.
I made sure, I don't know how I'm doing this, made sure that they like intertwined, the beats intertwined and like met at the right, crossed at the right times and all that with the character arcs, because they are integral to each other's plots. Like one character doing one, like the one POV character doing something is going to affect or cause the other character to do something. So it has been fun. I actually really like writing multiple points of view. I don't know. That's just kind of how I've always written.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and Scarlett, you have, well, not necessarily like alternating POV, but you've done multiple POV, like the same story from different points of view.
Which I find, I think, like I haven't tried that, but I feel like that's so much harder.
I don't know. I keep looking at my dog because my dog is driving me crazy. Yeah, she is amazing, but she is being weird. Yes, and so people think this. I don't know what this says about my ability to write, but people think that I wrote A Game of Fate at the same time as I wrote A Touch of Darkness, and I did not. But they intertwine so well and they work so well together, thank God, that people think that. So I had, the only thing I knew about that book was that Sisyphus was involved in that plot line, and that's it. And somehow I wrote a whole other book that intertwined with the Touch of Darkness. And I'm going to do it 2 more times, hopefully very well. We'll find out.
Wow, that's awesome. I love it. Well, and I guess the alternate POVs is kind of a different thing than like the secondary characters that don't have their own POV. So let's talk about those as well. I mean, and it sounds like, Alicia, like you're going to have, well, you both have pretty big casts like in your books. I'm assuming Alicia is going to have a big cast. So, I mean, how do you go about, I guess, deciding if a secondary character is going to have a sort of mini arc, or if they don't get their own arc, like how do you make sure that they're still presented as a fully developed character, or as, you know, somewhat developed character, shall we say?
This goes into refining for me. I met a lot of secondary characters in the first draft, and I have streamlined, downsized, and added a new one in the second draft, because I made the cast way too big, and so nobody was really that unique. There was just too many. So now I've chosen a particular group, and they each have an impact on the main character and the main story arc, and vice versa. I have the main character impacting them in some way. And I think even if it's just a small, like 3-chapter arc for a side character, and they don't have to change the way that the main character does. They just be shown more than just like smiling and saying good morning every chapter you see them. Yeah, I like to use side characters for twists and for like the fun playthings. Like, I think that's how you can, I think it's actually a lot easier to show a side character as fully developed than a main character, because you see them so shortly. Like, all you gotta do is like write a really clear, concise sentence, and like suddenly the side character has more depth than like the character whose point of view you're in.
I think it's so funny how true that can be, because yeah, I think I love the challenge of you meet a secondary character and you get this one slice, you know, maybe you see into their room for a moment, and the main character notices a couple of details, and after this paragraph we know a ton about them. We probably know what their lifelong desire is, and we know all this, you know, we can just intuit a bunch about them, and it's just this one little character portrait encapsulated in a paragraph, and that's so great. But when you're in someone's head and you're so close to them, it's so strange how it can happen that you're just too close that they almost end up feeling generic. And so you have to almost, you know, I think sometimes I have to step into that authorial voice a little bit, because I always write in third person, almost always. One of my books is in first person, but like in third person, you can step back a little bit and kind of give that character a little bit of the treatment, I guess, that you give to your secondary characters, and just reminding yourself that you might need to do that because they feel really fleshed out to you. But then sometimes when other people read them, they're like, why is your main character so generic? You're like, what? No, they're totally not. Yeah, that's really interesting. Scarlett, you have a big cast. Have you found that it's easy to like give us a, you know, fully fleshed out sense of the secondary characters?
In my Greek series, yes, because it's so easy to fold in little things about the history of a character just by like I don't know, in like one sentence. Like Alicia says, Aphrodite and Hades have this exchange where he mentions how she started, you know, basically started the Trojan War, and it's like, okay, well, we know, you know, like she has this history, and so it's really easy to fold in all of those kinds of things. And I love I love secondary characters, and they also scare me because I never quite know if, again, like they're going to hit home the same way that my main characters will, or vice versa. But I think I did a pretty good job with, in particular, Hecate and Hermes, because they're everyone's favorite. And Apollo, too, has really grown to be everyone's favorite. And I feel as though Apollo has more depth because of his arc. It's extended over a couple of books. And so, and his story has, I do believe, more depth, but that's because he gets into trouble a lot. So, but I enjoy that kind of thing. I see it as kind of like a challenge. Like, how am I going to give depth to this character, and how is that going to fold into the main story? And I don't know. So they're just not like, Hermes isn't just comic relief, right? How does he actively participate as a human friend, something in the story? So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. Like so actually someone had a question which ties in with exactly what I was going to talk about, which is like, when I think about my favorite characters of all time from the things that I've been a fan of, I don't think it's ever been the main character of anything ever. And I think that's partly because you almost have too much information. So the main character is too fleshed out, and I want to be able to imagine my own story for the character and like my own attributes for them. And I can do that when it's a secondary character that was only given this really brief, like, only have this brief role to play in the story. So yeah, I think it is important to like give the reader enough for those secondary characters that they can like latch onto them, but maybe you don't have to give them like every single thing. But so I guess now we have to answer, who is your favorite character of all time? And I don't know if this is like from our books or just from like any property ever. So probably, I guess you can answer it both ways. Alicia, this is a really hard one. I don't know if I can come up with like my favorite character of all time, but I'm gonna pick Alicia answer first.
I got it. I got my favorite. I mean, it's like a three-way tie, but the first character that came up to my head when you asked that is, he turned out to be a main character throughout a series, but in the first book of the Raven cycle. The first book is The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. My favorite, and now I've just like lost his name. Oh, Ronan. His name is Ronan. His character type is like my catnip. I absolutely love angry characters who snap at people and are really snipey and sarcastic, but they're actually cinnamon rolls with huge hearts and are in love with like everybody. But they are just like mad at the world.
Cinnamon rolls.
Cinnamon rolls with the like rock hard exterior.
That's so funny. I've eaten cinnamon rolls like that, actually.
Gooey center, hard outside. I don't know where I'm going with that. Wow.
Okay, so that's your favorite character from like other people's books. So we'll start there. So Scarlett, what's your favorite character from like other people's stories or things?
I had to think about this for a little bit, but I think I would say Éowyn, obviously from Lord of the Rings, because she is a feminist, and she is was a shield maiden, and she just wanted to fight for her people, and she did, dressed as a man, and she was a badass. And I love those kinds of characters. I like to try my best to write and embody those kinds of characters. So I would say her.
Oh gosh, I really don't think I can decide, and the reason being that like when I have a favorite character, it's not based on the canon of that story. Like I said, like I'll latch onto a character and then I'll make up my own story for what I thought would happen to them. So like it's not like I necessarily thought they were my favorite in the thing that they originally appeared in or like in the story. It's just that they were so cool that I wanted to put them in my own story, and that's the one that I really liked. And so it's hard for me to pick like an actual character that exists I don't know. And especially, okay, I think most of mine are from TV. When I think about like the characters that I don't know, like spent the most time coming up with my own stories for. So I would probably say I do really love, and I'm not caught up. I'm like several seasons behind. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I love The Walking Dead and I adore Daryl from The Walking Dead. He's like one of my favorite. And I'm just really hoping, I mean, it's my personal hope that he was going to turn out to be an asexual character, like as an asexual person, because he seems to be like throughout the whole series. And I haven't seen the final 2 seasons, but regardless, I love his relationship with Carol. Like they were both abused as children, and they have this really beautiful platonic relationship throughout this entire series. And it's like the most beautiful relationship of all time. And he's also one of those characters that like goes through a huge change. So he starts out as like, having all of these really like, he grew up in like an abusive family, and they had viewpoints on the world that he had to change himself, and he had to learn to like live by this code and like be a better person than he grew up. But yeah, it's mostly that platonic relationship. Like any show, like series that has this awesome like platonic relationship that's not usually represented. Like I loved Scully and Mulder until the X-Files had to ruin it, and like they finally like get together romantically. I was like, oh my God, you ruined the entire reason why I was watching the series, because you never see that represented. Like you never see like a male female, especially like platonic relationship represented on television as like the main relationship in a series. So I don't know, those are a couple of my favorite ones, I would say. But that was a tough question, Tony. Oh, and I guess I don't know if we wanted to answer it for our own characters or not. Scarlett, do you want to answer it? Who's your favorite of your own characters that you've created?
I love them all. I think I love them at different points. I think they're my favorite at different points, depending on what is happening in the story. So right now, like I'm having the most fun writing Isolde in KBB. So that's probably who I would tell you today. So.
Yeah, it does always change, I feel like. And people, every time I do like a school visit or something, somebody asks, what's your favorite book that you've written? I'm like, you can't choose your favorite book that you've written. No, you have to come
I do have a favorite book. I do.
What's your favorite book that you've written?
Malice. Malice is the book that is my favorite right now.
Well, right now, exactly, because it's the most recent.
Next it'll be KBB.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's still a favorite.
I always ask that question. I always ask who your favorite characters and which is your favorite book. I'm that person.
Well, okay, so tell us who your favorite character that you've created is then.
But nobody's read them.
Well, but who are they and why are they your favorite?
Okay. I did write a Ronin-esque character into my middle grade that a couple years ago. So I like it because I finally made him. The first couple drafts, I couldn't get this character's voice down. And it was because I secretly wanted to make him a Ronin type character, but I felt like I wasn't allowed to. And then I got over myself and did it. And so now he's my favorite character.
Funny story. Like, actually, I was visualizing Daryl from The Walking Dead for the dad in both of these books. The same type of dad visually, because he's like a rough and gruff biker who cries like at a sad commercial, or like he cries at anything, like really sobbing, like can't stop himself because he's just like overly emotional and can't control his emotions. So yeah, so I do love the dad in those characters, but I would say it's really hard to pick. I love actually the skeleton, like the personification of death in Skeleton Tree, because it's just so whimsical, and it was kind of patterned very loosely off my grandfather, who was like this very whimsical person too. And I just remember him like, we would like play make-believe, and I remember him coming out with like a garbage bag on his head and like all these things. And just like he's kind of like the inspiration for that character. So that's a good one. Thanks for that question, Tony. And we are going to wrap up, but if anybody else has a last minute question that they want to get in, go ahead and get that in the comments. But I guess let's see if there's anything that you want to leave people with in terms of craft or our discussion today about like getting all of those elements in place. It can be really overwhelming, and I know it's hard to keep motivated, especially if you feel like all of the elements are maybe not coming together in your story. So I guess let's leave people with advice for how to stay motivated, especially when you feel like a story maybe isn't working. Alicia, I was making Alicia answer first this week, but you got the hot spot today. So
That's okay. For me, and this also happened this year, the first draft of the novel that I was working on, that was like the hardest drafting, like first draft experience I've ever had. Because the voice wasn't what I wanted it to be, and the plot was going all sorts of everywhere, and I could just feel it unraveling as I went. But I'm really hard-headed, and when I give myself a deadline, I stick to it. So for me, motivation, my motivation right now has been that this is the career I want, and I can't stop even when I don't want to keep going. Like there were nights that I couldn't sleep because I was stressed out about having to write the next day. And I think I need to be more balanced and like take more time off. I do find that walking away from a scene or a chapter, even finishing my writing time early if it's not going well, walking away and doing something physical really helps my like idea brain movement. I get so many ideas and so many plots are fixed while I work out, while I'm trying to like focus on my like physical body. Same thing happens when I go on walks or take a shower. So for motivation though, yeah, I think ask yourself why you're wanting to write the story. And so when you feel at your lowest with it, remember that answer.
Yeah, that's really good. And it might change over time. Like right now, I was thinking in my head as you were talking, like, yeah, my motivation is that I want to eat food. So I have to write more books now. Like, that would be great if I could pay the bills or something. But yeah, it's going to change over time. And I also think you're going to have to accept that like not every story is going to come out perfectly formed, and you have to have some grace with yourself and not let that like guilt about having failed or something pile up, because if you do that, the guilt itself can prevent you from then putting more words on paper. And so I just come to realize like some books are going to be harder than others for whatever reason, and it may not be what you want. It might not be the best use of your time, but on occasion, you're going to have to write something over again. And on occasion, you're going to have to take those words and throw them out and put down new words. And that's just probably going to happen regardless of what you are writing. And so if you can find that place where you don't allow yourself to like beat yourself up because that happened. And it's hard when you're like stressing out. Like I'm stressing out about, I want to use my time as responsibly as I possibly can because I am doing this full time and it's a struggle, and you have to, eventually sell something. And so, it's like you can add stress if you stay in that mindset. So I kind of have to try to separate myself from that mindset of like, I really need to do this thing like in a certain timeline. Like try to separate that from the actual creative time when you're putting words on paper, and realize that, okay, this is all part of it, and take a deep breath and can do this. That's kind of my struggle right now, is trying not to stress myself out with the business side of writing. But Scarlett, what would you say? How do you stick with it even when it is feeling tough?
Well, I have a lot of people waiting. So I think that my motivation's changed over time. I have a lot of readers, a lot of people who are invested in my stories, which is very, very nice. But I also think that I try not to get too caught up in the roadblocks, because I just try to accept that this is part of my process, and I will have times when I struggle, and then I always get through it. Like every time I start a new novel, I'm like, oh, I forgot how to write novels when I just finished one, right? And I do it every time. And so I think the more you just embrace it as your process, the less those things will feel like, like writer's block or roadblocks. So I just, this is what I chose to do for the rest of my life. And it's a pretty great job compared to other things I've had to do. So.
And that is absolutely true. So we will leave it there for this week. And actually, I noticed, I think this is the last episode of our season 1. So maybe we'll have like a new theme or something next week for season 2. I don't know, but if anyone has ideas or requests for topics that they would like to see covered, just let us know. Get that in the chat. We are on Twitter at Writers Need Help. We're not super active yet, but we're on there, so go find us. And thanks to everyone for tuning in tonight. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.